From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capitol Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of Capitol Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
This is our podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. We do it so you don't have to. We're going to get to our number one story, get it, number one, in a few minutes. But first we're going to talk about a scoop that we have that was dug up by the Capitol Research Center, by our crack investigative team, and that is involves the plans for the inauguration and what some of the radical groups are going to be doing. We got our cameras in. We're working on a film presentation. You'll be able to see it on the internet, especially if you have one of those connections to those interwebs. And this is called America Under Siege, Civil War 2017, coming out right before Inauguration Day. What we found out when we looked into this group, J20 Disrupt, which is a group that's obviously J20 is a reference to January 20, and they're planning their protests, their demonstrations, their riots, whatever you have it, before the inauguration, during the inauguration, after the inauguration. And we discovered that as we went inside undercover, that they are planning demonstrations outside Mike Pence's house. This is on the 18th, 2 days before the inauguration. So we're talking about his personal house, not the vice president's mansion that he'll be moving into. And also they'll be blocking, or at least attempting to block, all forms of transportation into the city and basically bring the city to a halt and have the biggest demonstration there ever was since the dawn of time, or whatever. At least that's their goal. There are reports that the radicals are expecting to have, or hoping to have, 200,000 people. We'll see what happens when they get around to doing that. So that's something that will be coming up, and we hope you will check back to our website to get that, see that material that's coming up here in the next few days before the inauguration. Also, it's interesting. Here we are as we say, in the middle of the swamp, and part of that is we're at the center of things. If you look at Masonic conspiracy diagrams and look at all the lines that connect all the major monuments and places in Washington, D.C., we're sort of in the center of all those lines, and we're near everything from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. The Scientologists are just across and down the street from us. The church that Hillary claimed to be sort of a member of, had she been elected president, she would have been going there, I guess, on certain occasions. That's right across the street from us. And you have the Masonic Temple itself for the Southeast is right up the street. Well, we guess we have some interesting neighbors in that the Jeff Bezos, who's the, of course, founder of Amazon, owner of the Washington Post. He's moving into the Kalorama area, which is about a mile from here. In fact, almost exactly a mile.
You mean you're not talking about the embassy of the Republic of Kazakhstan?
No, I'm not, which is also in our area.
It's
here.
such an exciting diplomatic outpost.
I know, and you have to. That's when we get at least it's a safe neighborhood because the police are patrolling all the time because of all these offices and embassies and so forth in the area. So Bezos is a mile away. Now it's the same neighborhood that Ivanka Trump will be moving into with her husband, Jared Kushner, and the Obamas will be moving in there. So it's a very, very exclusive neighborhood, as you can imagine.
The Obamas, of course, are building a wall for security purposes around the place that they're renting in the Embassy Row part of town, which is just proof that walls work.
I suppose. And the place that Bezos has, it's, get this, 26,900 square feet. He paid $23 million for this. He bought it on October 21st through a sort of a shell operation, so they wouldn't know who the buyer was. And interestingly enough, of course, he bought it right before the election. So presumably he was hoping to hang out with his pals, and particularly the new president of the United States. I don't think he'll be hanging out that much with the president, as it turns out, because the election didn't go quite the way that Jeff Bezos would have wanted.
Oh, poor thing.
Poor thing. And it's like a lot of the people that, people are renting out their mansions in D.C. Through Airbnb. for the people who were coming for the inauguration. And interestingly enough, after the election returns came in, 90% of the people who had rented these mansions and other homes here, they said the average is about $160 a night normally, but $1,000 a night for the inauguration. $1,000 a night. 90% of those people canceled. So that means that I guess the election didn't go the way that those rich people who were planning on coming here for the inauguration thought it would.
Oh, those poor rich people.
Yeah, I know. And the impression is always that the people who are the wealthier are the ones who would vote for the Republicans or for Donald Trump and against the Democrats or for against Hillary Clinton. But in fact, we've done a study, and this is another scoop brought to you by the Capital Research Center. We had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week, written by Michael Barone, the great political analyst, based on our research, and this is now available on our website. And what it showed was that if you look at the top 300 zip codes nationwide, representing the top 1.4% in terms of socioeconomic status, that the contributions there were 60% to the Democrats. If you look at the big four metropolitan areas, the zip codes in the top 5% by socioeconomic status, that means like the rich and powerful people, then you find it was 65% Democratic. And if you look at the big four central city zip codes in the top 5% in terms of wealth and power, or as they say, socioeconomic status, that was 70% Democrat. And the thing that Barone wrote here, I'll just quote this one little bit. He said, half a century ago, many liberal commentators argued that Democrats, as the party whose policies allegedly represented the interests of lower-income Americans, had an unfair disadvantage in raising money for campaigns because they couldn't compete with Republicans for access to the checkbooks of the wealthy. The data presented here make clear that that argument, regardless of whether it was valid then, has no validity today. And of course, we just had an election in which Donald Trump was greatly outspent by the people on the other side, making the argument, by the way, that money is not the be-all and the end-all of politics, that you can get elected without sort of selling yourself to the rich and the powerful. And he seems to have made that point pretty well. So that study, that article by Michael Barone is on our website. So why don't you start off with your first story?
Well, I want to talk about how the pace of violent attacks against Donald Trump supporters has slowed in the last few weeks as we approach the inauguration. But we know that it's going to pick up at the inauguration, especially with perhaps 100,000 dangerous anarchists and other radicals, socialists and communists, coming to town as part of the J20 movement, the movement to disrupt the inauguration. As Michael Moore, the movie director, I like to call him the mockumentary director, said the idea is to shut down the inauguration itself, which will never happen, or at least force it indoors, as if to suggest that Americans are ashamed of their of the incoming 45th president of the United States, Donald John Trump. Now, we know that's not going to happen either, but the point is that these troublemakers want to cause as much trouble as they can, and no doubt some violence will come out of it. And, we might get some good action footage of police billy clubbing commies, which is something that always gives me a lift. I think that it's important to point out that the attacks on Trump supporters didn't stop with the election. We know that lots of people, there are a few Trump supporters who got out of hand and beat up Hillary supporters. Very few. But there's lots of people who hate Trump who beat up, who harmed, assaulted, attacked Trump supporters. The most prominent of those was last week the Black Lives Matter kidnapping in Chicago, where 18-year-old white man, Austin Hilborn, who has a disability. It's unclear what the disability is, might be autism or he's developmentally delayed. In any event, he's disabled, and he was kidnapped and tortured, possibly for days, by for out of control black youths in Chicago. And it's unclear if Austin Hilborn actually voted for Trump, but they took him to be a Trump supporter, and they said that they were doing the things they did to him, including, scalping him. They cut off, actually on film, live on Facebook Live, cut off part of his scalp. And then laughed about it. That was only the most recent attack, but there were a lot of attacks before that. There was a man who was accused apparently had made a joke that he was a Trump supporter, and that pissed off the wrong person in a bar. I think it was in Boston, and a couple were out on a first date, and it did not end well. The man was murdered as a result of supposedly supporting Donald Trump. There have been plenty of other attacks. Scott Baio, the actor who gave a keynote address at the Republican convention endorsing Trump back in Cleveland in July, said that he was attacked by another celebrity for supporting Donald Trump. There are all sorts of other attacks. There was a man who was in Chicago, I think his name was David Wilcox, and he was dragged out of his car and then beaten up and then dragged with his arm stuck in the nearly closed window. He's dragged a little bit in his car because he admitted to being a Trump supporter. So this sort of thing has become really commonplace, almost to the point where the media is not that interested in reporting on it. Obviously, they had to report the Black Lives Matter kidnapping because it's just so over-the-top shocking, and the fact that social media was employed to broadcast this torture live. And it's worth noting that the kidnappers, the torturers, showed their faces, called each other by first names, and thought they were having a grand old time. They may have been high when they did it, too, because they were puffing away on something. You can't tell in a video if it's marijuana, but it was something. And they were being very raucous. And in any event, there have been at least 24 anti-Trump attacks that I was able to document that have taken place since the election was over on November the 8th.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that we have on tape a guy named Bob Kramer, who was a Democratic Party operative, somebody who is important
in Chicago,
enough,
you mean, right?
Yeah, and important enough to have been to the Obama White House 342 times, I think it was.
Right.
And
legislative architect of Obamacare, he's called.
Exactly, and that this is someone who was talking about bringing people in who would start fights at Trump rallies. The idea was to create the impression that it was the Trump people somehow who were the dangerous ones that were tended to violence and so forth. And this was the impression they were trying to create. And it's interesting that after this came out, now you would think that the Democrats, at least they would be ashamed of this and that they would not want to be associated with this fellow anymore. In fact, he was at the front row the other night when the president gave his farewell address, and he could be seen on television there in the front row. He was in an honored position because, hey, as far as the Democrats are concerned, starting violence, violating the civil rights of your opponents, it's no big deal.
And this false flag operation aimed at making Trump supporters falsely appear to be violent hooligans was approved at the highest levels, including by Hillary Clinton, according to Robert Creamer, the convicted felon we've been talking about. He's a check-kiter. He's married to Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, Democrat, Illinois. So, this sort of thing is fairly commonplace, and there's probably I predict there'll be an uptick in it with the inauguration actually approaching.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to look at is, and this is something personal for me because I happen to have known Jeff Sessions for, 30 years or more.
And you're referring to President-elect Trump's Attorney General nominee.
That's correct.
The senator from Alabama.
Yes, and he has several strikes against him as far as the left is concerned. For one thing, he's a Southerner. Another thing is he has a Southern accent. He's also from Alabama, so that's three things. And then, of course, the fourth thing is that his name is Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, which is often referred to by people and left-wing commentators as showing that he was named after, of course, presumably the one of the Confederate generals, and who was very prominent, well-known, General Beauregard, and also after Thomas Jefferson. Now, of course, Bill Clinton was named after Thomas Jefferson, although he commented to some of his compatriots when he was young that he'd rather he had been named after Jefferson Davis if he was going to be named. That was Bill Clinton saying that. But in any event...
I think you left out Jeff Sessions' most grievous sin, and that is being Caucasian.
Well, that's one of the things, and that came up when...
Because there is no greater crime today against political correctness.
An MTV host, Ira Madison III, actually made fun of him because his Asian American grandchildren were present at his confirmation hearing, and this reminded me, of course, of when Mitt Romney's African American grandson was mocked by an MSNBC commentator during the 2012 campaign. But the thing about Jeff Sessions' name, it's so funny because, as we all know, it's important what a person's middle name is. That tells you a lot about a person. It's what his middle name is, and so the emphasis on Beauregard. This goes back to the Washington Post during the time when Jeff Sessions was nominated for a federal judgeship roughly 30 years ago, and the Washington Post actually headlined the story where they attacked him and they denounced him as Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. That was the name. And now we see that this crops up. The Nation magazine, leftist magazine, they call him that all of a sudden. The Daily Kos calls him that. And of course, as we all know, the importance of a person's middle name was brought up in the 2008 campaign. And that was when some people referred to Barack Hussein Obama. And those people were roundly denounced for their bigotry.
And this was by the Republican candidate at the time, 2008, absolutely. John McCain.
John McCain had to...
How dare you use my opponent's middle name?
He had to renounce a fellow who introduced him at a rally who had used the name Barack Hussein Obama. So it shows just one of those things that shows you some of the prejudices of the left. So what do you have next there?
Well, I wanted to talk about the wet foot, dry foot policy. That is the special immigration status that had been in place for 22 or so years since the Clinton era. And that was that if Cubans can successfully flee their country and set foot in the United States, in other words, that's where the name comes, dry foot, you get onto U.S. territory, you're in. If your feet still wet, you haven't made it to the shoreline, you didn't get in, and they can send you back. And it was a compassionate policy put in place to allow victims of repression from the totalitarian state in communist Cuba to ease their way into America, the land of liberty. And because Obama is best buddies with Cuban communist dictator Raul Castro and has been improving relations with the country, there is he has now made it more difficult for Cubans to escape, and many more Cubans as a result are going to be interdicted at sea and turned back. And we know what happens to people. It's a crime in Cuba to leave, if to be a Cuban citizen and to leave without authorization. So, are these people going to go back to firing squads? My guess is they won't, but they may go back to unpleasant circumstances. They may go back and not be able to find a job. They may be persecuted. They could be tortured. They could be briefly jailed. Who knows? But bad things will happen to them. And it's really shocking that President Obama would do this with just a few days remaining in his term of office. And, it's just the latest middle finger to Cubans and to Cuban Americans who are yearning to breathe free, to use that old expression.
And what some of the younger people in the audience may not know, they don't teach this in history books, unfortunately, is that there's a lot of guilt among people in the United States because American elites were key in supporting Castro, in helping him take over. The New York Times repeatedly lied and said he wasn't a communist. And in fact, it's so funny because after he took over in Cuba and started oppressing people, sending gay people to concentration camps, mass murder, people fleeing the country in little rickety boats and any other device they could get to get out to sea. Castro gave a speech at one point, and he announced that, in fact, he was a Marxist-Leninist, that is, a communist, and they confronted the New York Times reporter who had been covering him the whole time and kept assuring us that he was no such thing. And they said, well, what do you think about this, Castro announcing that he's a communist? And the New York Times reporter said, well, he doesn't know what he is. So this is how the elites covered up. And then, of course, there was the situation with the Cuban Missile Crisis where Castro, we now know, was actively trying to start a nuclear war with the United States. This fellow's a monster. The regime, of course, he died this past year. There were some news networks that treated it as one of the people we've lost, who we cared for so much. And this was Fidel Castro. Of course, his brother is still the dictator there.
Until he kicks off, which can't be that far into the future.
But unfortunately,
he's very old as well.
But unfortunately, because of the Obama administration, we've waited all these years for these monsters to leave this mortal coil, and so that we would have a chance to have freedom and democracy in Cuba. And unfortunately, the things that the Obama administration has done have made that much less likely. Let's talk a little bit about the number one story of the week, which is the Russia smear. And in case you haven't heard, and I'm gonna clean this up.
This is the number one story.
Yes, we're gonna keep this as clean as we can. But we have to talk about the details, and this is important.
It really pisses me off too.
Yeah, because I think leaving out the details is a disservice. People who hear the sanitized version, even places like Fox News, and they say, well, we don't want to spread terrible rumors about people that aren't true. But on the other hand, it's the details that make the story ridiculous. Because the story, here's how it goes. In September 2015, there was a Republican opponent of Donald Trump who paid for, and this was a supporter apparently of Jeb Bush, but of at least one of the Republican opponents of Donald Trump, who paid for Fusion GPS to dig up dirt. This is a firm that does research. They're the ones who concocted the cockamamie defense of Planned Parenthood after they were caught selling body parts on tape, and they made it seem like this had somehow been edited so that it was unfair, and many of the networks just bought that story and put it out there.
Unfortunately, that they're very successful at crafting a false narrative.
Right, when they were talking about crunchy, using a less crunchy method of abortion in order to preserve the body parts, and the woman who was a big official in this was talking about getting her Lamborghini and negotiating prices, which of course is not when you're just getting reimbursed, which is what they said they were doing. So anyway, so they concocted this total ridiculous story, but it protected Planned Parenthood, which gets $500 million a year from the taxpayers. So anyway, so this Republican goes to them and gets them to do research on Trump, and they start doing this. That's later picked up by a Democrat, who's paying for it after the Republican drops out of the race. And they dig up an MI6, a former MI6 operative, that's roughly speaking the British counterpart to the CIA, named Christopher Steele. And he digs up this really interesting story. And this is the story that Donald Trump had gone to the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow. And while there, he was in the presidential suite.
Who knew there was a Ritz-Carlton in Moscow,
by
the way?
Hey, apparently Donald Trump did. And he found it, and he decided, because that bed in the presidential suite had been used by President and Mrs. Obama. And so consumed by hatred was Donald Trump, and so perverted was Donald Trump, that he hired prostitutes to, I'll clean up, use the bathroom on the bed as a way of showing his disrespect and working out his sexual perversions.
Well, they showered disrespect all over the bed. Is that right?
Yeah. And so this, of course, was taped and videoed by the Russians, but totally to Donald Trump's surprise, because it would never have occurred to Donald Trump, who has business operations in 50 countries, that if he went to a hotel in Russia, that it might be bugged, like the Russians have always bugged every hotel where prominent people have stayed, or even less prominent people have stayed over the last, since before there were communists, even back in the days of the Tsar. So Donald Trump is completely blindsided by this. And then they use this to blackmail him, and they turn him into a Russian spy. And all the people working for him are Russian spies. And his legal counsel even goes to Prague for a secret meeting. Now, of course, it turns out he was never in Prague, but nevertheless, this is what happened. And this makes it into an intelligence report. Gee, how did that happen? Donald Trump kept saying that there's some people in the intelligence community who are trying to embarrass me by making stuff up. And now we know. Guess what? There were some people in the intelligence community who were trying to embarrass him by making stuff up. This is completely ridiculous. But it was the basis for a story that Harry Reid was promoting. That was the Senate minority leader, Senate Democratic leader, majority leader when they were in the majority.
And he's no longer in office.
And he's no longer in office. But remember, he's the guy who said that Mitt Romney didn't pay his taxes. And then when it was pointed out later that, in fact, none of that was true, his response was, yeah, it worked, didn't it?
It did. That's right. It didn't an innocent gym workout machine poke out his eye as well?
Yeah, something like that. It could have been mobsters, but we don't know because, hey, we don't report fake news like they do. So here you have these memos that he's promoting. Now, they get to John McCain, who, of course, hates Donald Trump. And I wrote the hardest I was ever on Donald Trump at writing a column was when he attacked John McCain, because I had worked for Jeremiah Denton, a fellow POW, and so I came to his defense. But here John McCain, who frankly has gone off the deep end in recent times, along with his sidekick, Lindsey Graham. John McCain passes it along. He works with this guy that was the former ambassador to Moscow under Tony Blair, in the British ambassador to Moscow. And they pass it along. It gets in this. It runs as an article in Mother Jones magazine, the left-wing magazine, an article by David Korn, a famous left-wing writer.
Also known as David Porn, because he loves lurid stories.
Ah, well, there you go. Well, it makes it into Mother Jones in October 31st, right before the election. And the regular media, even they occasionally show, some restraint. Of course, that was before Donald Trump was elected, and they had to make sure they brought him down because they thought he was going to lose anyway, and there was no need for them to get into this story. And what they're doing now is after this story, by the way, leaked because it was there were 8 members of Congress who were briefed on this, and that included the top leaders in Congress on both parties and the chief people in the intelligence committees, and apparently one of them or some other person who was involved in the briefing process leaked this, so it ends up at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed being a famously left-wing news type organization.
Run by Ben Smith, a notoriously dishonest reporter who worked for years at Politico newspaper.
And so left-wing that they refused to take advertising from the Republicans in this last election on the grounds that the Trump campaign, they said, is directly opposed to the freedoms our freedoms in the U.S. and around the world. And 2 days after that statement was put out, the CEO hosted a fundraiser for the DNC that was $33,000 a ticket. So I guess that's for the regular working people who support the Democratic National Committee. And he's contributed almost $500,000 to the Democrats since 2004. So anyway, here it ends. It makes it into BuzzFeed. And then it's part of this narrative about how the Russians hacked the election. And you see that we now have this story out there, and it's a critical part to understand how they commit these deceptions. They leave out the key details. A few years ago, there were allegations of child abuse against daycare workers, and in which the children claimed that after the daycare workers had abused them, that they then got on their brooms and flew away. And the jury was not allowed to hear the part about the brooms because that would have discredited the story that the children were telling, which was simply what was being fed to them by the investigators, and they were repeating it back. They're children. They don't know the difference between reality and fantasy. So they were telling these things. So these daycare workers were falsely convicted. And that's what they're doing here. They're leaving out the details that make this story as ridiculous as it really is, and only saying there are unverified reports, there are unsubstantiated reports, and saying things like that so that Donald Trump looks bad, and they can bring him down, they can discredit him, and they have no responsibility whatsoever.
And everyone knows the only person who rides a broom is Hillary Clinton.
Now, that's not nice. And so it's up to people in the media. I think you need to get out there, please tell the details of this story so that people understand exactly how ridiculous this story is. Donald Trump is not a Russian spy. The election was not hacked. The Media Research Center, by the way, did a study. They found 49 times that the major media, the three, CBS, NBC, CBS, had said that the election was hacked. It was never hacked. The only things that were brought up...
And what does it even mean that it was hacked?
Right. It sounds like and that they broke into the election counting process or the conduct of the election, the election machines, the kind of fantasy that's been floating around for years about the 2004
I guess
race.
they would have used the Jedi mind trick to make all sorts of poll precinct workers falsify documents.
These are not the presidential candidates you're looking for. And the thing is that you now have, according to a couple of studies, the majority or at least half of Hillary Clinton supporters and of Democrats saying they think that the election was actually hacked, that the votes weren't counted right because the Russians got into the system. This is a danger to our democracy when people lie like that. So that's our show for this week. We'll be back in a couple of weeks because we're going to take off for the inauguration so that we can cover it. We can be on the inside when all the radical groups are in town. We hope you join us when we come back. Please follow us at the Capitol Research Center on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and at Capitol Research on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President, Capitol Research Center, and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
Thanks for listening.